She never expected a conversation like this. Not in a quiet park, not on an ordinary day, and definitely not with someone she once thought she'd never understand. She had been raised with certain beliefs, not just religious ones, but social ones too. Ideas about people, cultures, and faiths that were shaped more by headlines than by experience. And among those ideas, Islam was always a mystery. Sometimes portrayed as strict, sometimes misunderstood, and often viewed through a lens of fear. But that day, something shifted. He didn't approach her to preach. He didn't carry a sign or quote verses or try to prove anything. He simply asked her how her day was going. His tone was soft, respectful, curious, but not intrusive. They talked about life, about how busy the world had become, and how people seemed to be chasing everything yet finding nothing. She was surprised by his calmness, by the way he listened. In a world full of noise, he carried silence that spoke louder than most words. When she asked what gave him peace, he smiled and answered, "My faith." He said it not with pride, but with gratitude, like someone holding onto a treasure he didn't want to boast about but couldn't deny. And when she asked what his faith was, he replied, "Islam," a word that once made her uneasy, but now came from someone who radiated kindness, dignity, and humility. As they talked, he didn't argue. He didn't criticize her beliefs or her past. Instead, he shared his own journey, how he once questioned life too, how he felt empty despite having everything, and how he found answers not in the world's noise, but in silence and prayer, in surrender to the one who created him. She wasn't sure why, but something inside her shifted. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. The peace he carried, the clarity in his words, the light in his demeanor. And then, almost without warning, her eyes welled up with tears, not from sadness, but from something else, something unfamiliar yet real, a stirring inside her soul. This wasn't about religion anymore. It was about truth, about love, about finding something that finally made sense. She had met many people before, but this man, this Muslim man, left her with something different, a glimpse of what peace really looks like. She had always been spiritual in some way. Even as a child, she believed there was something greater, a higher power watching over us, guiding us through the ups and downs of life. But as she grew older, religion became complicated. Questions didn't have answers, rituals felt empty, and church visits turned into routines rather than moments of connection. She longed for something real, something deeper, something that could touch her heart and bring clarity to her confusion. Still, she carried the belief that truth existed. She just hadn't found it yet. That afternoon, when she sat on a quiet bench after a long walk, she wasn't expecting anyone to interrupt her thoughts. But the man who sat nearby didn't intrude. He simply existed with calmness, like a peaceful presence in a chaotic world. They made eye contact briefly. He smiled gently, as if silently acknowledging her stress. And eventually, they began talking. Not about religion or faith, not at first. They talked about the weather, the state of the world, the pressures of modern life. Slowly, the conversation became personal. She shared how lost she felt. He listened, really listened, without judgment or interruption. Then she asked him, almost without thinking, "What gives you peace?" He paused and said, "Knowing why I exist." She raised an eyebrow. "And do you?" His answer was immediate. "Yes, Islam helped me find that." That one word, Islam, stirred something in her. She had heard it countless times in the media, often in negative contexts. She associated it with restrictions, conflict, even fear. But the man in front of her didn't match any of those images. He was calm, kind, thoughtful. The opposite of what she'd been taught to expect. She asked him more, not to debate, but to understand. And he responded with grace. He didn't push beliefs or try to convert. He simply shared. He told her how Islam taught him to pause in a fast-paced world, to pray not just with words, but with his heart, to value silence, reflection, kindness, and purpose. He told her about gratitude, about submission not as defeat, but as freedom. She listened with growing curiosity, and for the first time in a long time, things began to make sense. She didn't realize her eyes were filling with tears until her voice began to tremble. Something about his presence, his words, and the truth he carried felt like a balm to her restless soul. She wasn't ready to change her life overnight. But for the first time, she considered that maybe, just maybe, the truth she had been looking for had been there all along, just waiting for her to sit still and listen. That day, a conversation changed her. It didn't force her, but it awakened her. And the most unexpected thing was that the one who moved her so deeply was a Muslim man. She couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. The calmness in his voice, the certainty in his words, and the way he spoke about life with such clarity. It all echoed in her mind like a melody she couldn't ignore. For days afterward, she found herself replaying his answers, questioning everything she thought she knew. She had spoken to many people about faith before, but this time felt different. There was no pressure, no preaching, just sincerity. It left a mark. In the quiet of her room that night, she typed a question into her search bar. What do Muslims believe? It was a simple query, but the answers she found began unraveling layers of misunderstanding she didn't know she had. She expected to find rigid rules or distant theology, but instead she found a faith centered on submission to the Creator, kindness to others, and deep personal accountability. She was surprised by how much of it made sense. The 5 pillars weren't strange rituals. They were practical, grounding habits. The belief in one God wasn't abstract. It was powerful, pure, and freeing. She watched videos, listened to stories of people who had accepted Islam, and read personal experiences. Many of them sounded like hers, people who had searched, doubted, and struggled to find peace in a world full of noise. But what struck her most were the emotional transformations. These weren't people who blindly followed a new religion. These were people who had found answers, discipline, and inner peace. And most of them said the same thing: Islam gave my life meaning. That phrase echoed in her heart. She had always wanted meaning. She wasn't looking for a label or a group to belong to. She just wanted to feel close to God. To know Him, not through complicated theology, but in a simple, direct, and authentic way. And Islam offered that. Not a middleman, not a hierarchy. Just you and your Creator. What started as a casual conversation had now become a personal journey. Every step she took toward understanding Islam brought her closer to something she hadn't felt in years: clarity. And that clarity was beautiful. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like truth whispered gently into her soul. She began reading the Quran one verse at a time, not with the intention of converting, but simply to understand. Her whole life, she had believed in God, but His image had always been blurry, shaped by culture, sermons, and conflicting interpretations. The Quran, however, spoke differently. Its words were not abstract or overly poetic. They were clear, direct, and deeply personal. It felt like it was speaking to her, not at her. Like someone finally understood her confusion and was gently guiding her out of it. Verses about creation, mercy, justice, and purpose struck her deeply. She had never read a book that didn't just talk about God but spoke ace from God. The tone was unique, not written by a man trying to explain divinity, but by the Creator explaining Himself. That difference was profound. It didn't feel like she was learning a new religion. It felt like she was returning to a truth that had always been inside her, just hidden beneath layers of noise. She was particularly struck by how Islam approached questions she had asked all her life. Why am I here? What happens when I die? How do I get close to God? In other faiths, these questions were often answered with metaphor or mystery, but the Quran gave her answers with depth and clarity. She wasn't told to just believe or have faith. She was invited to reflect, reason, and think. It empowered her intellect instead of silencing it. And more than anything, it gave her peace, real peace. The kind that settles in your chest and quiets your racing thoughts. The kind that doesn't come from external comfort, but from inner certainty. Islam didn't just offer her a belief system. It offered her a connection, a personal relationship with the one who created her, who knew her doubts, her pain, her past. She realized then that the faith she had always longed for wasn't unreachable. It wasn't buried in complex rituals or distant institutions. It was right there in the words she was reading, in the simplicity of submission, in the power of monotheism, in the mercy of a God who listens when no one else does. And slowly, her heart began to open. She remembered one moment clearly when she read the verse, "Indeed, in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest." It was like the verse reached out and held her. She had never heard religion described in such a way. It wasn't about guilt or fear. It was about peace, real, quiet peace. For years, she had been searching for that rest, that stillness in her heart, and nothing had ever lasted. But now, as she read the Quran in the stillness of her room, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt seen. Each verse brought clarity. She had lived with so many questions. Why do bad things happen? What is the point of life? Why does God feel distant sometimes? The Quran didn't ignore those questions. It answered them. It acknowledged her doubts, spoke directly to the human heart, and reminded her that this life was a test, a journey, and not the destination. The more she read, the more she understood that her confusion wasn't a sign of weakness. It was an invitation to seek truth. She was also moved by how Islam spoke of the Prophet Muhammad, not as a god, not as a myth, but as a man of character, humility, and mercy. His life reflected the very message he was given. That consistency inspired her. In other faiths, she often saw a gap between scripture and behavior, between teachings and history. But here, the message and the messenger aligned. And that alignment gave her even more reason to trust what she was reading. She wasn't just intellectually convinced, she was emotionally drawn in. Islam didn't ask her to ignore her emotions. It honored them. It taught her that doubt could lead to certainty, that tears could lead to transformation, and that every sincere question had an answer. If only she would ask. She had once thought faith was blind. But the Quran showed her it was based on reason, reflection, and real connection. She didn't feel brainwashed or manipulated. She felt awakened. And as her heart softened, she understood something powerful. She hadn't stumbled upon Islam. She had been guided to it. And that realization changed everything. What shook her the most wasn't just what the Muslim man said. It was how he said it. There was no pressure, no debate, no attempt to win an argument. He simply shared his story, quietly, with sincerity in his voice and conviction in his heart. He spoke about the moment he first bowed his head to the ground in prayer, and how, in that moment, all the noise in his life disappeared. He spoke about how Islam taught him not just what to believe, but how to live with purpose, discipline, and compassion. She listened closely, expecting contradictions or rigid rules, but instead she found answers, clear, calm, and consistent. He explained that Islam isn't just a religion, it's a way of life. From how you wake up in the morning to how you treat your neighbors, Islam weaves faith into action. It wasn't about claiming perfection. It was about striving to be better every day. That humility, that realness touched her, because she had seen too much of religion being used to judge others. But here was a man who used it to judge himself first, to improve himself, and to serve others. He spoke about women in Islam with such respect, quoting how the Prophet honored his wives, how daughters were a blessing, how modesty wasn't about shame, it was about dignity. She had always associated religion with control, but now she was hearing about empowerment, balance, and inner peace. She felt tears forming, not out of sadness, but because something deep within her was being acknowledged. Something she had kept silent for years. When he finished speaking, he didn't ask her to convert. He simply smiled and said, "Ask God sincerely from your heart. He listens." That was the moment her heart broke and opened. She went home that night and did exactly what he said. No fancy words, just quiet, honest prayer. And in that moment, for the first time, she felt close to something real, to something higher, to truth. It wasn't the logic alone that moved her. It was the warmth, the gentleness, and the calm strength in the way it was shared. That's what Islam gave her, a way back to her heart and to the one who created it. She was no longer searching. She had found the answer. As time passed, she found herself returning again and again to the memories of that conversation with the Muslim man. It wasn't just what he said. It was how it stayed with her, quietly reshaping her thoughts and softening her heart. She had been raised with certain ideas about Muslims and Islam, most of them shaped by media, politics, or second-hand opinions. But none of them prepared her for the peace and clarity she felt in the presence of someone who lived their faith with such humility and grace. What continued to surprise her was how Islam seemed to connect everything she had always felt but could never fully explain. The idea of one God, the emphasis on intention, the balance between faith and action, it all felt natural. It didn't demand blind belief, it invited reflection. It encouraged her to ask questions, to read, to understand. And the more she did, the more she found herself nodding in agreement. Not just with her mind, but with her heart. She began to notice changes in herself. She was more patient, more thoughtful. She started to value her time differently, her words more carefully, her purpose more deeply. Even the 5 daily prayers, which at first seemed overwhelming, began to feel like moments of stillness she didn't know she needed. They became a rhythm, a reminder, a way to step back from the chaos of the world and reconnect with what truly mattered. Her tears were no longer from confusion or pain. They were from relief. Relief that she didn't have to carry her questions alone. Relief that she had found a way to approach God that made sense to her soul. Islam hadn't forced itself on her. It had simply stood quietly, offering light where she once saw only shadows. Eventually, she embraced it, not as a rejection of her past, but as a continuation of her search for truth. She didn't need grand signs or miracles. She just needed honesty, peace, and sincerity. Islam gave her all of that. And now, she looks back at the moment that Muslim man spoke to her, not as a random conversation, but as the beginning of everything. Sometimes, the most profound journeys begin with a single moment of sincerity, a kind word, a peaceful presence, or a truth spoken gently. For this American woman, that moment came from a Muslim man who never preached, never argued, but simply shared what Islam meant to him. His words opened a door she didn't even know existed, leading her to a path of clarity, peace, and closeness to the one she had always been searching for. Her transformation wasn't instant. It was thoughtful, deep, and full of quiet reflection. But that's what made it real. And today, her story stands as a powerful reminder guidance comes when the heart is ready, and sometimes all it takes is a sincere conversation to spark a complete change of direction in life. Thank you so much for watching this story. If it touched your heart, inspired you, or gave you a new perspective, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us continue to share these real and meaningful journeys that the world needs to hear. Until next time, stay open, stay kind, and keep seeking the truth.